My brother managed to land a job thanks to my husband's recommendation, and within weeks he treated the place like his personal shopping mall. We're not talking about sticky notes or pens. He walked off with expensive electronics and somehow thinks no one should be mad about it. For context, my husband Dan manages inventory at a tech hardware company, so this wasn't just a casual slip-up, it was a direct hit to his professional reputation. But here's where it gets wild. My parents are furious, not at him, but at me. And the way they justified it will make you question what family first really means. Family first, unless you're not the favorite. In my family, family first has always had a very specific meaning. Everyone pitches in to save my younger brother Jake, 29M, no matter how reckless his choices, while I, 34F, end up in the role of fixer. It never meant equal support or fairness. It meant my energy, money, and patience were resources on demand. That pattern didn't suddenly appear in adulthood. It was built from the time we were kids. One example still sticks with me. Jake took my bike without asking, rode it straight into a tree, and totaled it because he didn't believe the brakes were important. The fallout, I got punished for not keeping an eye on him, and my allowance was taken to cover the repairs. He, meanwhile, got rewarded with ice cream later that night. That wasn't a one-off event. That was a snapshot of how things always tilted in his favor. School life reinforced it too. When Jake failed math, my parents didn't hire a tutor or hold him accountable. They volunteered me. I'd already had a packed schedule, but suddenly my after-school hours became math lessons with a kid who thought calculators were cheating. My grades slipped as a result, and instead of anyone noticing that I was stretched too thin, I was told I wasn't being a supportive enough sister. That summed up the imbalance. He struggled, I sacrificed, and somehow I still came up short. Looking back, those moments weren't just frustrating, they programmed me to see myself as the backup system. If something broke, if Jake fell behind, if responsibility had to land somewhere, it landed on me. I didn't just learn to expect it, I learned to anticipate it, because letting go meant bracing myself for one of my parents' lectures about being selfish. That same script has followed us into adulthood. Jake has stumbled from one failed job to another, usually blaming bad luck or unfair bosses. Meanwhile, my parents hype him up like he's a misunderstood genius who just needs another break. Never mind that breaks have already come by the dozen. If he struggles with rent, I'm expected to chip in. If a friend cuts him off financially, my parents push me to step up with a temporary loan, which everyone knows translates into giving money I'll never see again. Even when they suggested he move into our home until he got back on track, it was packaged as an opportunity for me to demonstrate compassion. But in reality, it meant extending Jake's streak of zero accountability and giving him access to our refrigerator on an endless loop. When I finally ended that arrangement, my parents didn't scold Jake for coasting. They accused me of being heartless. Their picture of him has never changed. To them, he's fragile, unpredictable glass that might shatter with the slightest nudge. They talk about his failures like they're traumas, framing every misstep as something others should cushion. When I set boundaries, I'm painted as selfish. When I refuse to finance another emergency, I'm accused of putting him in danger, as if my no was a plot to strand him on the side of a highway. The effect on me has been exhausting. Being cast as the reliable one made me view myself less as a sibling and more as a permanent crisis manager. It's not just that I help, it's that I'm expected to fix. And when I refuse to, the guilt trips roll in like clockwork. Even other relatives have noticed. A cousin once joked that if Jake burned down a house, my parents would blame me for not teaching him about fire safety. Everyone laughed, but it wasn't far from the truth. For decades, responsibility has circled back to me, while Jake racks up more new chances. That cycle hasn't stopped evolving, it's just gotten bigger in scale. Jake isn't wrecking bikes anymore, he's losing jobs and living beyond his means as an adult with every advantage. But the response from my parents is the same. If I stumble, I'm criticized. If he stumbles, there's a rescue mission. They've perfected the art of rewriting every crisis into a story where he is misunderstood and I'm cast as the one who needs to step in. And it's exactly that mindset that created the latest escalation. Because when Jake was jobless, again, it wasn't framed as his responsibility to solve. Instead, my parents wanted me to step up once more, but this time in a way that would drag Dan into the mess too. The cousin of nepotism we don't talk about. When my parents floated the idea of Dan bringing Jake into his company, they didn't frame it as a request. They dressed it up with soft words like opportunity and fresh start. What they really meant was, convince your husband to do the heavy lifting we don't want to do anymore. They expected me to push Dan into hiring my brother, as though my marriage and my husband's career were bargaining chips for family loyalty. Dan was very clear about what that meant. Recommending someone for a position at his company wasn't the same thing as giving a friend a ride somewhere. It was him attaching his own name and credibility to Jake. He told me point blank that vouching for an employee is taken seriously, and once you put your reputation on the line, it sticks, whether the person rises to the occasion or drags it through the mud. For someone whose entire job revolves around accountability and detail, the idea of staking that trust on my brother wasn't just risky, it bordered on self-sabotage. There was an irony baked into all of this. Dan is the kind of manager who lives and breathes structure. He plans, he double-checks, he makes sure no one on his team is guessing about expectations. If you had to visualize responsibility in human form, it would practically be him. On the other hand, Jake's version of professionalism is rolling into work after noon and declaring victory if he remembered to bring his phone charger. The gap was so wide you could see it from space. It wasn't just unlikely that Jake would meet Dan's standards. It was almost comical that my parents believed this could work. And that mismatch wasn't invisible to me. I could already see the disaster forming. In my head, I imagined Jake waltzing into the office with yesterday's shirt, brushing off lateness as a traffic miracle, and somehow expecting to be praised for showing up at all. I knew the script. I'd lived through it in different forms for years. The pattern was identical. He promised he'd change. Everyone convinced themselves this was the turning point, and I got stuck dealing with the fallout when it all collapsed. But logic never stood a chance in these conversations. My parents have perfected the art of guilt. They're like two musicians who play in harmony, taking turns striking every note they know will push you closer to giving in. My mom leans on sweeping lines about belief and second chances, drawing out silences like every pause is proof of my heartlessness. My dad follows with blunt appeals to morality. What kind of sister wouldn't help her brother back on his feet? It's not about discussion. It's about cornering you until resistance feels crueler than compliance. Then there was Jake himself. He stood there with that well-rehearsed look of determination, the same one he'd used back in high school when he swore he'd finally handle chores or keep up with homework. He added his predictable promises. This time it would be different. This time he'd step up. This was his chance to prove himself. At 30, you'd expect those words to carry weight only if they were followed by action, but with him they were just recycled lines. He spoke with confidence, like he believed saying it out loud made it true, and somehow my parents treated those empty claims like gospel. From the outside, you'd think anyone would see what was happening. The entire situation looked like the setup for a sitcom, the tightly wound professional husband stuck babysitting the unreliable brother-in-law at work. You could almost hear the laugh track waiting to kick in, but my parents either didn't notice or didn't care. They reframed it as Jake's chance at transformation, his big moment to turn over a new leaf. They invented a story where a job, handed to him rather than earned, would magically rewrite years of the same behavior. Dan, to his credit, kept his composure. He sat there quietly, weighing the risk. Every part of him knew what was at stake. It wasn't just about filling a slot on his team. It was about attaching his name, the name he'd built up for 10 years, to someone who treated responsibility like it was optional. But the corner he found himself in was nearly impossible. Say no, and it looked like he didn't care about supporting family. Say yes, and he took on the weight of my brother's failures before they even happened. It was less of a choice and more of a trap. The pressure didn't come in one sweeping blow. It built gradually, filling every empty gap in the conversation until it felt like there was no air left. That's how my family operates. It's not shouting, it's not obvious threats. It's rope pulled tighter and tighter, covered in soft words about love and duty. That way, if you resist, you're not rejecting a plan, you're rejecting the idea of family itself. And in the end, that's how decisions get made. Not because they're smart, not because they're fair, but because saying no feels unbearable. So Dan agreed, reluctantly, warily, but he agreed. Outsiders looking in might have seen kindness, a successful man lifting up his brother-in-law. On the inside, it felt like stepping onto a track where you already know the train is coming. The optimism my parents wrapped around it, this idea that Jake just needed the chance, was the same story they'd told 100 times before. Hope, effort, failure, the cycle was about to spin again. I could see it, Dan could see it, but no amount of clarity could compete with the fantasy my parents wanted to believe. And that was where things landed. Dan with his reputation tied to someone who never earned trust, my parents satisfied because their golden child had been saved once more, and Jake basking in unearned confidence. As for me, all I could do was wait, because if history had taught me anything, it wasn't a matter of whether the collapse would come, it was only a matter of when. What I didn't expect was how that collapse would begin. For a short while, things didn't look so bad. In fact, the first few weeks were surprisingly calm. And then, just when it almost seemed like Jake might prove us wrong, something happened, caught on camera, that changed everything. The honeymoon period, aka shockingly functional brother. I'll be honest, when Jake actually started the job, the outcome caught us off guard. For once, there weren't immediate disasters or complaints. During those first months, he showed up on time, kept himself presentable, and even gave the impression that he wanted to learn. Compared to his history of skipping obligations and shrugging off responsibility, the contrast was jarring. It wasn't anything extraordinary by normal standards, but for him, it was unusual enough to notice. Dan came home most evenings with quick updates, delivered like field notes from an experiment he didn't fully trust. He clocked in early today. He asked questions instead of standing around. He took notes. Each observation carried that same tone of disbelief, as if Dan was waiting for the other shoe to drop. None of this would raise an eyebrow with a typical new hire, but in the context of Jake, even competence felt like a headline. The very fact that his coworkers weren't rolling their eyes or filing complaints counted as progress. Neutral reactions meant no red flags, and for Jake, that alone was considered noteworthy. He even made it through orientation and daily routines without incident. Following processes, respecting schedules, and engaging at least on a surface level, it looked like he was doing the bare minimum, which for him was already a considerable shift. Instead of constant excuses, there were indicators of effort. Dan remained skeptical, but he admitted that during those weeks, Jake was holding it together. To Dan, it was stability. To me, it was an eerie calm, an unfamiliar version of my brother that I didn't entirely trust. Our parents, of course, absorbed this news the way they always do, as proof that Jake just needed faith and opportunity. Every call from them carried a smug edge laced with comments like, "See, we told you he only needed support," or "He's finally on the right track." They seemed eager to rewrite his history, replacing years of short stints and failures with a single narrative of triumph. My father even described him as finally finding his footing, as though 3 months of steady attendance outweighed a decade of negligence. And maybe because of that pressure, part of me wanted to believe too. I caught myself letting a little hope slip in. What if this was the start of an actual change? What if the responsibility finally stuck? As suspicious as I felt, I couldn't help but imagine how different life would be if Jake really followed through. Watching him survive probation without being sent home felt almost surreal, because the possibility of him turning a corner, however slight, tugged at that reserved corner of hope I'd trained myself to suppress. Still, experience told me otherwise. I'd seen this cycle play out before, the trial version of good behavior that always expires. It's a pattern he perfected, enough initial effort to buy goodwill, then a gradual slide back into shortcuts and excuses. I remembered old relationships where girlfriends praised him in the beginning, only to discover later that the promises didn't hold up. I remembered when he moved in under the guise of getting back on his feet, only to let others cover his bills. The faces and settings changed, but the script never did. This was the honeymoon stretch, steady enough to calm everyone, just impressive enough to give him the image of a reformed man. Even Dan, cautious as he was, softened slightly by the end of probation. He never said he trusted Jake completely, but his tone shifted from watchfulness to cautious approval. Passing the 3-month mark without an issue gave him reason to think maybe, just maybe, this job would be different. He wasn't convinced, but he wanted to be. Meanwhile, Jake leaned into the role of the changed man. He called our parents often, updating them about normal shifts as though each one was evidence of personal growth. "I'm really doing it," he'd say, talking like a person who just discovered the concept of responsibility. They didn't just accept it, they glorified it. My mother repeated his words back like she was recounting inspirational news. My father praised him at Sunday dinner as if reporting on achievements far greater than clocking in at work. Ordinary actions, arriving as scheduled, following orders, not causing friction, became celebrated as monumental victories. From the outside, it might have looked like a small redemption narrative. A man with a checkered past steadies himself thanks to family support and finds his footing. That's exactly how my parents framed it anyway, but beneath it, I felt the tension set in. I couldn't enjoy the calm because I'd lived with it too many times before. The quiet never lasted, not with Jake, and even as everyone praised him, I braced for when his pattern would finally resurface. The atmosphere at home reflected that tension. Every time Dan began with, "So here's how today went," I found myself holding my breath, prepared for the first sign of unraveling. And when his report stayed neutral, the relief was uneasy. Silence didn't reassure me, it made me anticipate the storm building behind the scenes. In most families, no bad news means things are fine. With Jake, no bad news just meant we hadn't discovered the problem yet. Still, I'll admit the act held longer than I expected. Making it through probation at all gave the impression that perhaps his streak of collapses had finally ended. But deep down, I understood what was really happening. This was the setup phase, the act before the slip. The normalcy was thin, constructed, fragile, more like a balance waiting to tip than a new foundation. Because eventually that calm cracked, not with lateness, not with laziness, but with something far bolder. By the time the truth surfaced, it wasn't whispered complaints or subtle issues, it was undeniable proof. The kind of proof you don't hear about secondhand, but see directly with all the clarity that leaves no room for argument. And that hard evidence left no space for excuses. It was security footage, plain, direct, and impossible to explain away. And once that came out, the story of Jake's so-called turnaround shifted fast. The five-finger discount career strategy. The truth behind Jake's sudden downfall wasn't subtle. He was caught on camera trying to leave the building with high-end graphics cards and other electronics stuffed into his backpack, straight out of the locked inventory cage. Management confronted him immediately, and HR didn't hesitate. They terminated him on the spot. In a company where Dan's entire team exists to safeguard valuable equipment, theft isn't a gray area. It's the one line you can't cross. For Dan, the cost of this wasn't just professional embarrassment. Colleagues had trusted his recommendation, and now that trust had been compromised. Worse, the situation could have escalated into a police report and criminal charges worth thousands of dollars. The only reason it didn't come to that was Dan himself. He pulled management aside and convinced them to treat this as a one-time goodwill gesture. No police, no record, just termination and expulsion from the building. That decision preserved Jake's ability to find work in the future, but it cost Dan a piece of his own professional credibility in the process. He extended protection that Jake hadn't earned and didn't even seem to value. Jake, on the other hand, didn't react with alarm or contrition. He didn't freeze in fear over what he had risked, and he didn't seem shocked at the seriousness of it all. Instead, he took the discovery with a kind of bewildering detachment, like being fired for theft was closer to being written up for wearing the wrong shoes. That disconnect became even clearer once he began offering his explanations. His first attempt was that he believed the boxes looked abandoned, as if sealed, barcoded equipment in a locked cage somehow signaled trash. When that fell flat, he pivoted. He admitted he needed money, and desperation drove him to it. That didn't fix anything. All it revealed was that he had willingly decided his paycheck wasn't enough, so the company's property was his backup plan. Neither story held water, but he rotated between them as though one might stick if phrased just right. Dan described the confrontation as surreal. Jake didn't posture aggressively, but he wasn't apologetic either. He carried himself like this was a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with the right tone. At one point, Jake even suggested he planned to return some of the gear once he figured things out. It was an argument so bold and absurd it almost felt like parody. Borrowing electronics from an employer is not borrowing, it's clear-cut theft. That he spoke these words to a manager who stakes his career on preventing such losses made the moment feel more like a parody sketch than reality. What elevated the absurdity was his casual confidence. He acted as though employees dip into storage all the time, as if it's not a big deal to pocket merchandise worth multiple paychecks. Companies in this sector don't overlook missing stock. Every component that passes through Dan's team is tracked and accounted for with digital logs, barcodes, and cameras. The idea that high-end graphics cards could go missing without anyone noticing was laughable, but Jake clung to it as though imagining it might make it true. Dan bore the brunt of that fallout. Trust in his judgment and the recommendations he made was now under review in every quiet hallway glance. Even though he had done everything possible to handle the matter swiftly, his credibility had been dented by association. He had argued for Jake's hire, vouched for his reliability, and spared him legal trouble when things fell apart. That effort didn't preserve his reputation fully. It only spared Jake from consequences far worse than unemployment. The disconnect only deepened in the days that followed. To Jake, what happened wasn't theft, it was punishment exaggerated out of proportion. He spoke about it like he had simply crossed some unclear boundary, as though being dismissed for stealing was an overreaction by uptight management. The way he painted it, losing the job wasn't his fault, it was the company's rigidness that destroyed his chances. He made himself out as the victim of circumstances rather than the architect of his own firing. And when this version of the story reached our parents, the spin spread faster. Their reaction wasn't anger that Jake had betrayed Dan's trust or stolen from a place that kept him employed. It was outrage that the company had dared to enforce consequences. To them, it was unbelievable that one mistake could end a job so abruptly. They acted like companies in the real world should hand out second and third chances for conduct that anywhere else could involve police. Their ability to absorb Jake's excuses and reshape them into a tale of his mistreatment was both familiar and infuriating. Jake leaned into that sympathy. He played the misunderstood son whose risks had been blown out of proportion. In his version, he wasn't a thief, he was unlucky. He had been too resourceful in the wrong moment, and the company had overreacted. It didn't matter that video footage existed or that Dan had negotiated to keep him from facing criminal charges. In the alternate narrative playing in my parents' living room, he was simply someone who got caught bending the rules and deserved a chance to prove himself again. On paper, the whole saga was predictable. Nepotism hire, brief honeymoon period, catastrophic collapse by committing the one offense no employer can forgive. But in person, it played out far stranger in that Jake never once behaved as though his choices carried lasting weight. That lack of accountability, paired with my parents' willingness to defend it, turned a serious situation into something almost surreal. Instead of recognizing theft for what it was, they called it bad luck, harsh treatment, or misunderstanding. For Dan and me, the incident closed a chapter. Jake had been given an opportunity, squandered it spectacularly, and avoided criminal charges only because of extraordinary lenience. End of story. But in my family's universe, the story was just beginning. Because if the company had committed the sin of letting him go, someone had to step in and fix it. The real confrontation wasn't with Jake anymore, it was with the people who couldn't accept that reality. And that storm made its way to our doorstep next. Parents versus reality, round 1. When the firing became official and word reached my parents, the first calls came within hours. They weren't stunned into silence or asking what happened. They were already angry, already convinced I was at fault, and already demanding action. Their position was simple. I needed to convince Dan to undo the decision and give Jake back his job. The theft itself, the footage, the HR meeting, none of it mattered. What mattered to them was that I wasn't repairing it. The direction of their anger was startling. Instead of calling Jake out for walking off with equipment, they scolded me like I had been the one with electronics stuffed in a backpack. My father's voice hardened right away, zeroing in on Dan. He declared that my husband should protect his own family, by which he meant rehiring Jake. To him, family duty meant bending Dan's career until it snapped. My mother, on the other hand, took the pleading route. She told me I needed to sit Dan down, appeal to his compassion, and beg him to give her son a second chance. The language she used wasn't about fairness or consequences, it was about mercy, as though Dan owed Jake another try simply because of blood ties. I kept trying to bring the conversation back to reality, pointing out that Dan had already done more than anyone could reasonably expect. He hired Jake against his better judgment, he staked his own reputation on recommending him, and he even persuaded management not to involve the police when the theft was discovered. That reprieve protected Jake from a criminal record. Yet when I reminded my parents of that, they brushed it off like it was trivial. They acted as though sparing him from legal trouble was the bare minimum, and the real test now was whether Dan and I would go the extra mile and hand him his old job back. The calls did not stop. My phone filled up with messages, switching between guilt-driven appeals and heated directives. One moment my mother would send a long text about not abandoning your brother in his darkest hour, and the next she'd be calling again, speaking through tears about how this would ruin his future unless I intervened. Then my father would ring, speaking in that commanding tone he always used to end arguments. To him, this wasn't a discussion, it was an obligation. In his eyes, refusing meant turning my back on family loyalty. The roles were stark, Dan as the executioner, me as the person with the power to reverse it, and Jake as the wronged party waiting to be rescued. It didn't stop at words. Both of them showed up at our house, moving their pressure campaign into our living room. They sat me down as though staging a formal family meeting, poised between dramatic appeals and accusations. My mother's refrain was that this was about forgiveness, as if theft was a personal slight you could hug away rather than a violation of workplace trust. She spoke slowly, with deliberate emphasis, testing every angle of sympathy. My father interrupted her often, correcting my responses with statements about what family does, as though quoting from some unwritten law. Every sentence reinforced their belief that the real failure was Jake stealing. It was me refusing to erase the consequences. I could feel myself being pulled back into the role I'd occupied since childhood, the fixer. They framed it exactly that way. This was my chance to step up, to show loyalty, to prove I wasn't just looking after myself. But no matter how they phrased it, the line was the same. Dan had to take Jake back, and it was my job to make that happen. Every attempt I made to explain the seriousness of workplace theft, every reminder that Dan's entire career was on the line, slid past them. They didn't debate the facts, they redefined them. Jake's actions were minimized, Dan's refusal was dramatized as cruelty, and my reluctance was treated like betrayal. I thought emphasizing Dan's perspective might break through. I reminded them that recommending Jake had already strained his standing with management, and that pulling strings after a theft would shred what was left of his credibility. Instead of taking that in, my father leaned forward and said, "If Dan really cares about this family, he'll take the hit." The hit, that was his word for it, as though jeopardizing a career and sacrificing professional integrity were routine prices for kinship. To him, protecting Jake was proof of love, even if it set fire to everything else. Meanwhile, my mother kept circling back to the idea of a second chance. She insisted that everyone makes mistakes, that all Jake needed was one more opportunity to show his growth. I had to remind myself that she wasn't talking about tardiness or carelessness, she was talking about attempted theft from a locked inventory cage. But in her universe, the difference didn't register. She spoke as though Jake had missed a curfew, not nearly brought police into the company. Her plan was simple. I was supposed to appeal to Dan's heart, explain how hard life had been for Jake, and beg him to let it go. Their persistence turned absurd quickly. At one point, they told me that if roles were reversed, they would move mountains to help me. But their comparisons didn't make sense because I'd never been caught stealing from an employer, never put them in the position of asking someone else to gamble their career on me. They lumped together normal family support with this situation as though covering theft fell under the same category as handing over gas money or helping with chores. It wasn't just unfair, it was entirely disconnected from reality. As the lectures dragged on, what struck me most was how completely the blame shifted. Jake barely came up in their scolding. Instead, I was the obstacle, the one holding him back, the heartless sibling failing her role. They didn't deny what he'd done, but they treated my refusal to fix it as the real crime. In their view, the actual theft had already been handled, and the only question left was whether I would show loyalty. They had inverted the hierarchy so thoroughly that saying no became the unforgivable act. It drained me, the hours of calls, the uninvited visits, the constant guilt layered over the shouting. It was a pressure campaign designed to wear me down. Their words carried a rhythm, a repetition meant to hammer the message in until it felt easier to surrender than resist. I could feel the impulse to cave rise in me, the familiar guilt looping in cycles. But every time it swelled, I pictured Dan's face in that meeting room, standing between management and the idea of police charges, and I knew I couldn't betray what he had already risked. He had given Jake the only lifeline left, and my parents had the nerve to demand more on top of it. By the end of those confrontations, it wasn't about Jake anymore. It was about whether I would obey, whether I would prove myself as the compliant daughter and sister they wanted me to be. Refusing marked me as disloyal. Every word, every plea, and every accusation led to that same cornering conclusion. If I didn't act, I wasn't family. And that's where the tension hung. Their anger sharpened, their appeals grew louder, and the pressure ratcheted up another notch. It no longer felt like conversations, it felt like build-up towards something more forceful, something designed to leave no space for choice at all.